Well, dear colleagues, dear friends, I'm honored and happy to be with you today at the Virtual International Conference on Redefining Theories of Communication, 21st Century Perspectives in Language and Literature. And it is my great pleasure to represent Karazin Kharkiv National University, Kharkiv, Ukraine, in our common cause of promoting research and academic activities in the domain of humanities and science as a place for enlightenment and transformation. Today, we are going to speak about something that is inside us and outside, something that cannot be actually seen or even touched, at the same time being the most beautiful thing in the world, about something that must be felt with the heart, making human beings both more human and humane, something that in global philosophy deals with attaining communal as well as individual harmony as the integrity of heaven and earth, ultimately securing the oneness communication of the universe. What is it? It is emotions. Yeah. To be more exact, the communication category emotions, whose multimodality in the discourse of art, where language and literature make a multifaceted immersion, constitutes our subject today. In other words, together with you, we are reflecting on multimodality of the communication category emotions in art discourse, a perspective of fractal semiotics. Cognitive and emotional responses to art have long been a controversial subject of scientific debate, but only quite recently have they become an actual anthropocentric focus of extensive research in affective science, cognitive psychology, psychology of art, cognitive linguistics, language, literature, discourse studies, and semiotics. This explicates the current significance and topicality of the present research, aimed at revealing the fractal semiosis multimodality of the category emotions communicatively actualized in art discourse, especially taking into account the current need for coherent transdisciplinary approaches to studying aesthetic emotions, whose meaning cuts between and across disciplines, mends the gap between science and humanities, their concepts and language of creation. For that matter, pursuing the line of realizing our set objectives to reach the above aim, our first step is within the methodological framework of cognitive linguistics, fractal semiotics by Benoit Mandelbrot, and cognitive theories of emotion and art, as you see, Clure, Gibson, Oatley, Palmer, and others, we are going to concisely substantiate the multimodal nature of the communication category emotions, concentrating on fractal semiotic peculiarities of its ontology in art, and on the specificity of art discourse as our research factual material. Here, at the present stage of our scientific work, we mean emotion-evoking objects of visual art, music pieces, the corresponding contemporary art, criticism, literature, and academic articles analyzed. All this explicates the novelty of the research. Second, on the theoretical grounds, we examine how this categorical multimodality fractally functions in the communication ecology of art discourse, specifically in discourses of visual art, installations, and music, tone painting. With, just a second, here, this is our research material. So that's installations and tone painting, with a special emphasis on the cognitive mechanisms of metaphorization and metonymization as both representatives of the core categorical conceptual characteristics experience stimulus, appraisal, emergence time, direction, and trigger tools of actualizing different synesthetic experience creating modalities of both narrative and non-narrative nature. We will conclude with summarizing the key points of the present research fragment as methodological implications for further exploration concerning the verbalized communication category emotions in art discourse. Speaking about the category emotions as a multimodal entity in the discourse ecology of art within the framework of fractal semiotics, let's have a closer look at fractal semiotics as a multimodal ontology of the communication category emotions in art discourse. So far, the majority of modern studies of full-fledged emotion have been modality-specific, with linguistics and literature studies concentrating precisely on the verbal representation, and psychology focusing on the nonverbal expression of emotion, the face, the voice features, and the body. Our suggestion is that it is best to conceive of the category emotions as a multimodal semiotic discursive construct in the communication ecology of the Homo sapiens as Homo sentiens mind, particularly in their intentional relation to bodily states, motivation, beliefs, and desires, necessarily having a formal target as a property implicitly ascribed to the emotion target, in virtue of which the emotion can be seen as intelligible. For instance, someone's fear of something construes a number of features as being frightening, and it is someone's perception that makes a certain emotion fear rather than some other emotion. In this connection, we emphasize the communication, discursive nature of the category under consideration, because emotions can be experienced, conceptualized, categorized, and expressed only by a discursive experiencer, a person who produces discourse, who in the course of his or her communicative activities, both real or virtual or digital, becomes more specific as a communication experiencer, responsible for communication efficiency and activating the potential of the corresponding language experiencer to generate verbal messages as verbalization of the conceptual ingredients of the category emotions in our case. Therefore, the first dimension in the research framework suggested involves the resources of verbal manifestation. On the one hand, since language is a special conceptual space that is organized around certain anthropological categories as their discourse ecology, and nonverbal expression, on the other hand, where the concept nonverbal implies turning to ways of emotion representation in movement, sound, and art expression discourses as key lingua culture semiotics, actualized by verbal means, thus proving the interdiscursive essence of the category emotions in its radical aspect, which stems from its multimodal matrix nature, which determines multimodality of its lingua-cognitive actualization in discourse. Since emotions presuppose channeling through various media for their communication, in its basic sense, their multimodality is a cluster of several modes: textual, oral, spatial, visual, haptic, etc., used to compose messages that, acquiring verbalizations, represent emotions in a number of cultural and social contexts to create a single social lingua-cognitive artifact that exists in the human mind ecology or in a digital environment. Indeed, the above-mentioned semiotic systems, objectivized verbally and serving as ecology, where emotion is represented, can be defined as modes. That is, both culturally and socially shaped resources for making meaning that possess different model resources, breaking modes in parts. Eventually, modes representing concepts of emotions as constituents of the category emotions aggregate into multimodal ensembles of familiar cultural forms expressing emotion, whose nonverbal discourse is actualized through critical meta-discourse about them. Because our core factual language data are primarily empirical lexicographical units, we have found out that meaning tokens of the name of the category research and of the nominations of its conceptual components can be characterized by quite a large scope of different peculiar properties. Among them, the following 6 turn out to be prevalent. Automatic appraisal that is tuned to quick onset, brief duration, and typically unbidden occurrence. Second, distinctive physiological reactions, because every emotion can be distinguished quite specifically. Third, distinctive cognitions. We mean thoughts, memories, images. Fourth, distinctive subjective experience, initial experiential base, stimulating a certain emotional reaction and resultative experiential input to be cognitively preserved and interpreted, enhancing the intensity of a certain reoccurring emotional response to the same or associatively similar stimulus. And finally, interpersonal orientation, together with characteristic behavioral and motivational features. Indeed, the list of meaning properties received through analyzing numerous definitions of the phenomenon and focus includes the initially discussed aspects of the emotional experience, cognitive content, and the distinct subjective feeling experience of emotion. Yet, to our mind, neither of these by itself suffices to adequately characterize emotions and verbal ways of representing their concepts. Surprisingly, the list reveals further meaning properties of the emotional experience that have to jointly be taken into account to characterize the large variety of emotions to a more significant extent. We thus need a multi-factor account of emotion. In spite of their plurality, they share general functions, which is also embedded in the theme or meaning content under consideration, characteristically involving the following ones: a phenomenally encoded appraisal of the environment or the cognitive system itself, then a preparation and motivation for action by the elicitation of physiological changes, and a typical expression, facial expression, gestures, body language, which is mainly automatic, sometimes instinctive, that indicate the emotion itself and the action readiness towards the other subject, contributing to communication and interaction, which is, again, means flexibility of behavior response, which can be essentially increased according to the degree of cognitive content involved. Our yet another finding as a result of the definitional analysis conducted is that the behavior caused by an emotion can also be varied according to experiences and be deliberately adjusted to a certain situation or event. These common functions of emotions, encoded in the semantic structure of emotion names, nominations of the corresponding conceptual construals within the verbalized category emotions, once again allow us to characterize them as a unitary class based on the category concept emotion, which later on will be important for our further research in the category emotions represented in English, studying the conceptual structure of this category. In a more explanatory format, all this can be seen in the table on the slide, enabling us to have a clearer mental picture of the sketch architectonics of the theme content of the lexeme's nominations of the category emotions, conceptual ingredients, as any lexical meaning is a cluster of integratively interrelated semantic characteristics, describing what is actually nominated, thus representing the structure of a certain lexical meaning considered. Besides, as emotion multimodality is permanently evolving, the addresser-addressee relationship within a certain sociocultural framework evolves as well, presupposing discursive choices in representing the category emotions. Currently, concepts of basic emotions, joy, sadness, interest, surprise, anger, fear, and disgust, as it has been explained above. Those mainly include both. For one thing, the quantity of expressing conceptual content, simple or complex semiotic means like a single facial expression represented verbally versus consecutive expressions from one or more modalities, for example, dancing or films. And for another thing, the context of representation, individual, that is not expressed to others, and interactive, in other words, expressed to interactants or communicative persons to be subsequently analyzed in relation to the emotional interaction structure. From our perspective, the multimodal nature of the category emotions and the format of its interpretative representation is also determined by its belonging not only to the range of radial cluster categories, but also to such formats of knowledge as cognitive metrics or matrices in plural, regarded as systems of interconnected cognitive contexts or domains of conceptualizing objects, since the linguocognitive entity represented by the word emotions accumulates multi-aspect knowledge, whose realm has the so-called cognitive focus nucleus emotion and the periphery made up of various cognitive contexts as aspects of the corresponding knowledge field necessary to understand the linguocognitive content of the categorical focus under consideration. In our case, they tend to comprise conceptual domains: philosophy, religion, medicine, biology, psychology, cognitive science, neuroscience, arts, and many more. All the above, incorporated into our emotiological analysis, leads us to being fully aware of the fact that intersemiotically represented multimodality turns out to be an inalienable discursive characteristic of the linguocognitive matrix emotions, enhancing the so-called emotional granularity of Homo sapiens. Currently, there are lots of intense debates as for definitions of emotions, their classifications, ways of studying them, which makes the field seem rather confusing. Cognitive approaches offer a clarifying perspective, focusing on causes of emotions, their effects, mechanisms of their conceptualization, verbalization, and communication. We have come up with the conclusion that at present, most of definitions of emotions encountered in psychological and linguistic literature assume emotions and feelings as their experiential parts to be attribute processes parallel to other psychological and physiological processes of a cognitive, motivational, or conative nature, a particular elemental kind of intelligence, an important and integral part of the system of human behavior, functioning as multi-componential dynamics that doesn't necessarily cohere in fixed packages and that continuously changes. Emotions get conceptualized, acquiring, according to the results of our previous research stage, their core conceptual features: experience, stimulus, appraisal, emergence, time, direction, which experimentally proved to be categorical for the concepts of basic emotions. Aesthetic experience has two outcomes: aesthetic judgment and aesthetic emotion. Since art experience is claimed to be one of the most powerful forms of eliciting and communicating emotions, we regard it and its corresponding discourse as one of the most potent experience stimuli of emotions to be conceptualized, categorized, and verbalized, determining their appraisal and direction conceptual characteristics. Since in the linguo-cognitive environment of art, visual, oral, embodied, and spatial aspects of Homo sentiens emotions, their concepts forming the category emotions, and their discourse actualizations generating other types of emotional experience to be conceptualized, constantly interact in various dimensions. We consider the category emotions constituting the subject matter of our work to be an ontologically multimodal fractal entity with its unique fractal semiotics that continually expand the space of human aesthetic experiences on the basis of recursive cooperation among emotion, cognition, semiotics, language, and culture. Following Jeff Bessemer, the above status can be substantiated by the following theoretical underpinning assumptions that directly refer to conceptual components of the category. First, fractal multimodality assumes that representation and communication always draw on a multiplicity of modes that contribute to meaning sustainability. It can be observed in the way the category emotions functions in the multitude of its conceptual art realizations: visual, spoken, oral, gestural. Second, fractal multimodality presupposes that resources are socially shaped over time, which is the case with emotions and their linguo-cognitive representations in art discourse, articulating socio-culturally determined affective meanings through their choice of a cognitive semiotics mode. Finally, meaning of emotion and verbalizations of its conceptual representation is construed through selecting and configuring modes as outcomes of the linguo-cultural shaping through their use, with the significance of their interaction foregrounded, which is obvious in the realm of art concepts of the category emotions that are objectivized in different art contexts. The above plausibly includes intersemiotically mapping semiotic resources of a number of emotion ontological modes, such as visual, communication, color, texture, gesture, sound, voice, music, to name a few, susceptible to their multifaceted verbal objectivization in discourse of artworks, reviews, and criticism. Well, empirical linguo-cognitive experience proves that meanings of verbal representations of emotions, even their nominations, simultaneously activate several domains that in their conceptual entirety make a matrix. At the same time, the domain emotion is perceptively rooted in human affective systems. Therefore, it belongs to basic domains as cognitively irreducible representational spaces or fields of conceptual potential, directly tied to pre-conceptual gestalt or gestalt embodied experience. In this connection, we assume that concepts of emotions, intrinsically making the category emotions and representing it in a number of semiotic ways in our discourse, possess properties of fractals in terms of the theory of fractals by Benoit Mandelbrot. Understanding a fractal as a shape or entity whose basic features reappear in different scales, defined by a recursive process that generates autosimilar structures, combining structurally irregularity and consistency, we have found out that there is a close affinity between natural fractals, their semiotic ontology, concepts of emotions, and their language or literature representations in our discourse, which comprises several dimensions: structural autosimilarity, scalar relativity, irregularity, formal consistency, fractal dimension expressed in the multimodality of the category emotions itself. Taking into consideration the specificity of the subject matter, cognitive fractal semiosis, we have developed a methodological triangulation whose goal is to provide research interdisciplinarity within the respective field of inquiry through integrating various methods derived from three perspectives suggested by Jordan's letter, presupposing the corresponding methods in one project. First, the subjective perspective that involves methods of conceptual analysis, including focusing on conceptual metaphors and metonymies as conceptual representation fractals of the category researched, evoking various modes of synesthesia. Then, phenomenological analysis, systematic intuitions applied to reveal perceptions. Second, intersubjective perspective, relying on empathy and imaginative projection to uncover peculiarities of social or art interactions. And finally, objective perspective, implying observation and modeling to study ontological features of the category emotions in art discourse. Thus, the category emotions actualized in art discourse has been proved to be a fractal, multimodal entity whose research presupposes using methods of cognitive linguistics, cognitive fractal semiotics, and discourse analysis. Now, we are moving ahead to the following part of our reflection, where the focus is on actually multimodality of the communication category emotions actualized in art discourse, a fractal semiotics approach. This part of our research presents fragments of our linguo-cognitive semiotic analysis of the installation artwork of London Design Biennale, as an example, themed emotional states, and the music genre of tone painting, also known as word painting. The attention focus is on actual ontological fractal semiotics peculiarities of the multimodality of the category emotions actualized in these types of art discourse. A special emphasis is on the role of cognitive mechanisms of metaphor and metonymy as triggers of various modes of synesthesia, substantiating the fractality of the category examined. Here, it has to be pointed out that from this multimodal study perspective, art discourse is both emotion-arousing works of art and relevant art criticism, as dynamic art history about recent objects, involving judgment without assumption, a flow of ideas, conversations, and attitudes that make up the contemporary art ecosystem, making, writing, exhibiting, believing, appreciating, and so on. Thus, discovering heterogeneous modalities of the fractal categorial organism emotions draws upon the core multimodal research concepts of modes, semiotic resource, modal affordance, the concept developed by James Gibson, which strengthens the idea that individual and the environment are interconnected and cannot be analyzed separately, and their intersemiotic relations. According to Antonio Damasio, an emotion and its concept as a building block of the category emotions are dispositive images, the so-called dispositional representation that holds the rules to reconstruct perceptual images multimodally through human senses, their mental objectivizations and verbalizations that affects the body internal state, not being the perception of it. Moreover, every emotion, every burst of passion, every exercise of will is like cognition. Indeed, emotions and art are intimately related, which results in five-part emotional experience. First, the art addresses pre-expectations and self-image. Second, cognitive mastery and introduction of discrepancy concerning the work and understanding the work. Third, secondary control and escape, presupposing higher order cognitive involvement and mentally withdrawing from the work to resolve it emotionally. Then comes metacognitive emotional reassessment, which implies self-awareness and emotion awareness through a work of art, with subsequently editing one's own self-image. And last but not least, aesthetic outcome in the format of a new emotional response, a new mastery of the art. The above elements of aesthetic experience obtain their conceptual and verbal objectivization through cognitive operations of metaphorization and metonymization in art discourse, both of installations as a domain of visual art and tone painting in music. let us have a glimpse of our analysis concerning the realization of the fractal multimodality of the category emotions in the discourse of the Australian installation artwork called Love as part of London Design Biennale Emotional States, representing over 40 countries from 6 continents. And here comes our citation, examining the full spectrum of emotional experiences, from anger to joy, sadness to disgust. Following director of the event, Dr. Christopher Turner, who continues, the installations propose radical and provocative ideas and investigate the important relationship between design, strong emotional responses, and real social needs. So it is a type of art that belongs to visual semiotics, as it is based on one of the senses, vision, naturally including any visually perceived information. All right, love, both its figural composition, the visual mode fractal, with its title, the verbal mode fractal, and art criticism concerning love allow us to reveal its unique semiotic code of verbally actualized conceptual metaphors and metonymies, whose co-occurrence influence the emotional interpretation of the artwork in a cluster of other core modalities of emotion ontology, such as eletic, mandatory, possible, impossible, deontic, assigned or forbidden or allowed, axiological, epistemic, opinion, behavior, temporal modality, and spatial, here, there, nowhere. For instance, visitors get embraced by an enlarged rainbow color wash made from 150 strands of fiber optic light, each one of a different color. In this way, its designer Talbot communicates the feeling of love and the emotion of openness, and celebrates the country's newly passed legislation that makes all bonds legal. The enlargement seems deliberate, probably suggesting the visual manifestation of the conceptual metaphor more of form is more of content, and significant is big, implying the revolutionary nature of the social breakthrough in Australia. The size of the installation is magnified, and viewers have to look up, which may manifest the metaphorical reasoning being subject to control of love. In fact, Flynn himself says, I wanted to explore a positive emotion and represent a positive Australia. Now in the air, there is a new tangible feeling of what love means. Tangible feeling plus visual effect. Evoking the synesthetic associations, in particular those of chromesthesia, ideesthesia, spatial sequence, triggered by conceptualized and verbalized feeling experience response, the concept law itself, actualized multimodally, proves to be of a fractal nature, emerging and acquiring multimodal reinforcement through light, color, scaling, and open space, air. I see love as a full spectrum emotion and have used the full spectrum of color. That's what the author of this installation says. At the same time, conceptual metaphor and metonymy make a strong conceptual bond in the artwork discourse studied, since the metonymic interpretation offers the contextual foundation via which metaphors can be construed. This gets especially conspicuous in the interpretation of the missing heart lines on the surface under the rainbow, which can be conceptualized as missing the true source of love. The conceptual contiguity seems crucial in the process of construing the meaning of the nomination, verbally representing the examined conceptual element of the category emotions, because the heart inspires the metonymy, the container for the contained. By entailment, the heartless or the damaged-hearted can evoke the opposite meaning, such as lack, missing parts of heart for lack of true love. Besides, the container image schema also contributes to the fractal semiotics representation of the culturally determined conceptual emotion meaning of the whole installation. In that lingua culture, the heart is regarded as an organ with which emotions are associated, and love in particular. And this conceptualized and discursively actualized part of the body metonymically evokes the corresponding feeling. The title of the installation can also serve as the so-called anchorage, and that's Roland Barthes' term, because it makes interpretations of emotions more specific. Therefore, it can be assumed that the category emotions is actualized in all the above modalities, rooted in blended art perception, and can be analyzed as a fractal model in the dynamic creation of its emotional, conceptual components. Love being one of them in our case of example. Another art ecology of the category emotions, frequently going together with creating installations to enhance emotional impact, that we are going to briefly consider in this work is music. Music contemplation can trigger multiple emotions, being a metaphor and metonymy of emotions in itself. There is much evidence for a stable connection of music, cognition, emotion, as type of communication with various synesthetic implications. Music is a product of mind, and its physics of the cosmos vibrational elements of frequency, form, amplitude, duration are not really music until they are neurologically transformed, conceptualized, emotionally interpreted by the brain, multimodally categorized, acquire characteristics of timbre, loudness, time, or the tonal frame, evoking new emotional intersemiotic experiences. Thus, the conceptual elements of the category emotions turn out to be anchored in music perception, revealing its various modalities, like in the case with the art of installations. It is especially clear when we focus on tone painting as the musical technique, when music reflects the literal meaning of a song's verbal vocalization lyrics. This type of the category emotions ontology goes back to Gregorian chants, whose authorship is generally credited to the Benedictine monk Paulus Diaconus. They can also be called contemporary art, since they are fruitfully used in lots of marginal or hybrid arts nowadays, including visual arts discussed above. These concepts of emotions are verbalized by means of nominations that express both emotion and theological meanings. In this connection, it is worth pointing out that the 8th century treatise, De Octotonis, on the 8 modes, even compares musical tones to the letters of speech, and the treatise transmitted in the 9th century manuscript of the Carolinian tonary of Metz compares the 8 modes to the 8 parts of speech in Latin grammar. To illustrate, according to the results of a melodic semiotic functional analysis, the pattern fa, mi, sol, la, metaphorically, on the synesthetic basis of ideasthesia and spatial sequence, seem to represent the sufferings and death of Christ with his resurrection into glory, where fa, mi signifies deprecation, sol is the note of resurrection, and la is above the resurrection, which through conceptual metaphors, metonymies, and synesthetic associations, the lighter the brighter, gains a new meaning. Besides, every time the combination fa, mi, sol, la placed on words from the biblical Latin text emerges, as you see, fatum, laxis, mira, gesterum, etc., it is assigned to be performed on ad libitum or et libera, freely, which for Christians signifies that Christ liberates people from sin through his death and resurrection. Can be Christ, can be God, can be any higher power that liberates us from earthly burdens. Modern examples of tone painting as a metaphorical and metonymical tool of discursively actualizing concepts of emotions within the fractal framework of the category emotions are very, very numerous. For instance, Hallelujah by Cohen, where the words it goes like this, the fourth, the fifth, the minor fall, the major leaf, the baffled king composing Hallelujah, express the movement of the keys mentioned in the analysis of Gregorian chants and the tone progression. Toxicity by system of a down, such a contrast, with its octave descends and returns up at a slower tempo, slowing the global scale of what is happening to this world at the words, "How do you own disorder?" Another example is the first chorus in Despacito by Fonsi, where the music is slowed at the word Despacito, and Bohemian Rhapsody by Freddie Mercury, where in the phrase escape from reality, for example, escape is sung at the highest note and reality is much lower, to name just a few. This observation proves that the fractal multimodality of the category emotions in this domain of art discourse has already become a natural aspect of music perception and of the way concepts of emotions are semiotically represented. And closer to our conclusions, the theoretical perspectives of cognitive linguistics, fractal semiotics, theory of multimodality, cognitive theories of emotions, and art under consideration. The present work has laid out a tentative, comprehensive approach to studying the communication category emotions as a multimodal complex result of fractal semiosis of emotions, their concepts and verbal representations in discourses of visual arts, installations, and music, tone painting. Our main findings are based on the revelation and recognition of the multimodal nature of the category researched, actualized in semiotic fractals of metaphors, metonymies of emotions, and their intersemiotic relations on a continuum of conceptual complexity. That turn out to be at least 4 crucial implications in this connection. First, conceptual ingredients of the verbalized category emotions are anchored in art perception. Second, they acquire their fractal representation in clusters of modalities, comprising the alethic, deontic, axiological, temporal, spatial, epistemic ones that are recursively realized verbally, visually, orally in close association with synesthesia triggered by conceptualized and verbalized feeling experience response. Third, the interaction of metaphor as a representation of emotional concepts with other cognitive operations lets us expand the range of possible meaning construction processes, including synesthesia in its chromesthetic, ideastatic, and spatial sequence dimensions. And finally, metaphor-metonymy interactions in multimodal ontologies are much more complex than the volume of inference involved in decoding a single metaphor or metonymy in just verbal environment, which creates more associations and conceptual fields, facilitating the process of understanding emotions and the content architectonics of the category emotions. All the above predetermines the perspective of our research, which is a more in-depth analysis of the fractal semiotics multimodality of the communication category emotion in multiple dimensions of art discourse, aimed at building a comprehensive interdisciplinary methodology of studying multimodal categories within the framework of cognitive linguistics, cognitive fractal semiotics, and lingua culturology, with a special focus on mode hierarchies, modeling the category as a fractal semiotic system. In this way, discovering a wider range of communication applications in language and literature. Thank you for your attention. And I'm looking forward to continuing our cooperation in as many formats as possible. And from the bottom of my heart, I wish you only positive, bright, warm emotions, wonderful moments of communication, good music, smiles, discoveries, health, and happiness. Many blessings today and always. And once again, thank you for your invitation and for listening, for your time listening to me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you so much, ma'am, for throwing light upon the multimodality of communication and its methodologies. Thank you so much, ma'am. It was a delight to our ears.